Last Monday, the California state legislature approved a $100 million plan to help California's struggling weed industry. And no, this isn't a practical joke. The California government is taking out $100 million worth of taxpayer money to support an industry that was supposed to bring in literal billions. Today on Politimax, we're talking about California's surprisingly failing weed industry. 5 years ago today, California voters passed Proposition 64, also known as the Control, Regulate, and Tax Adult Use Marijuana Act. And just the proposition did exactly as its formal name implies. It made recreational weed legal and, most importantly, taxable. Advocates of Prop 64 had estimated that the act could potentially bring in over $1 billion in tax revenue per year, with most of the garnered funding going towards social programs such as childcare. So without a doubt, all this sounds pretty simple, right? You legalize weed, you regulate it, you tax it, and then you reap in the easy money, right? As stated in this article featured in the LA Times, many cannabis growers, retailers, and manufacturers have struggled to make the transition from a provisional, temporary license to a permanent one renewed on an annual basis, a process that requires a costly, complicated, and time-consuming review of the negative environmental effects involved in a business and a plan for reducing those harms. In other words, since the passing of Prop 64, many cannabis growers, retailers, and manufacturers have been struggling to make the transition from what is called a provisional license, aka temporary license, to a permanent license. Now, as the name suggests, a temporary license is just that, temporary, and only lasts about 12 months. The goal of a temporary license is to essentially buy the business owners enough time to conduct what is called a CEQA analysis while still being allowed to legally sell, grow, and manage recreational weed. And this is where the problem lies. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is a CEQA analysis? It's essentially a self-funded, government-mandated review on the negative effects said cannabis-related business will have on the environment. If you're also wondering, yes, the CEQA, aka the California Environmental Act, is a government-ran program, and yes, it is very expensive to conduct this analysis. Oh yeah, and if you're also wondering, yes, that $100 million of taxpayer money is indeed going towards funding this government program that is already funded by your taxpayer dollars to help fund an already heavily taxed industry that was supposed to bring in $1 billion this year alone. Makes sense? So if you're from California, you should already know that before the passing of Prop 64, we already had a pretty strong illicit weed market. In fact, it might have gotten stronger since the passing of Prop 64. As stated in the previous LA Times article mentioned, in 2019, industry officials estimated that there were nearly 3 times as many unlicensed businesses as ones with state permits. Although some industry leaders believe enforcement has reduced the number of illegal pot shops, a study in September by USC researchers estimated unlicensed retailers still outnumbered those that were licensed. Supporters of legalization blame the discrepancy on problems that they say include high taxes on licensed businesses, burdensome regulations, and the decision of about 3/4 of cities in California not to allow cannabis retailers in their jurisdiction. In other words, the legal weed industry is just not competitive enough to compete with the illicit market. But to make this issue worse, this is all self-inflicted. Just to give you guys an idea of how much damage this self-inflicted wound is doing, let's make a comparison. The average upfront investment to open a dispensary in Oklahoma is in between $80,000 to $140,000. The average upfront investment to open a dispensary in California is in between $80,000 to $250,000, which includes a $1,000 application fee that has a good chance of being denied, but also includes higher wages for workers and much higher rental costs, which means ongoing operating expenses will cost you between $30,000 and $70,000 each month. Yeah, self-inflicted. In my opinion, the issue here starts with regulation, more specifically, over-regulation, which means to regulate something to an excessive degree, and that's exactly what we're seeing. We're watching an industry that has already pulled in billions of dollars per year from an illicit market, barely pulling in $500 million under a legal market. In fact, experts are even claiming that the illicit market may have even grown since the legalization of weed. And why? Well, if you look at the data, it's pretty clear that this CEQA study is one of the core things to blame. Not only are there 3 times as many illicit weed shops in the state, but over 82% of all legal weed shops are still on a temporary license, as they have yet to either afford the study or be approved for the provisional license. And who here is being affected by this overregulation? You. Those $100 million is coming out of your pocket as a taxpayer to help fund the weed industry in California. And as we should all know at this point, California sure as hell loves 2 things: taxes and regulations. This is ironically what would inevitably lead to the weed industry's downfall. Furthermore, unbeknownst to the bureaucrats who created these regulations, there's already a pretty strong established black market in the state. And as we should all know, if supply becomes far too expensive for demand, then illegal shit is usually bound to happen. And because of this, every taxpayer loses. Ironically, this complicated issue has a simple solution. The state of California could just lower the requirements and cost for the study, or even introduce a blanket tax. But knowing this state, well, they probably won't.